My name is Maria Vallejo. I work for the Club for Sarah Lawrence, and I have this distinct honor of introducing Ms. Leah Olson. And I wrote my notes down, so I hope you don't mind that I read them. She's been a part of the ESLC community since 1987. She received her BA from Evergreen State College and her PhD from SUNY Albany. Her dissertation focused on the neurobiology of circadian rhythms. Leah teaches general biology here at the SLC, but she also teaches a very sought after and oversubscribed the biology and psychology of emotions. I know that because I tried to get into the class, which is a seminar that you're participating in today. She just finished, or is finishing, a co-author book on emotions called The Feeling Brain, the biology and psychology of emotions, and we're lucky that she's part of the SLC. And with that, please take it away.
Thank you. And I should emphasize that is co-authored with my colleague Elizabeth Johnston. And we together have been teaching this course, we developed this course called The Feeling Brain, the biology and psychology of emotions. Now, I think as long ago as 2001, we've offered it about, I think, 4 times, or it probably was a little after 2001. And the field of looking at the role of the brain in emotions has just been exploding. It's just now impossible to keep up. I mean, how we started that course was actually because a number of students had started to come to me for conference projects when I was teaching other courses related to the brain, and they wanted to study emotions. And I would say, well, there really isn't very much work on emotions. You know, here's what we do have, here's what we do know. Most of it relatively historical, not very much current research on that topic. And I'll talk about why maybe in a moment. But then I started noticing more papers coming out on emotions, so I would put them in a file that I could keep for any subsequent students who were interested in it. And after a while, the file started growing and growing, and pretty soon I had this really huge file, and I realized I had to start subdividing it, right? I couldn't just have a file named emotions anymore. So I started subdividing it in terms of topics that seemed to be emerging within it. And it was about that time that I ran into Elizabeth one afternoon and, remarked on this huge explosion in emotions. And we had actually taught a course once before, although she is a psychologist, she also has strong background in sort of the biology, physiology of the brain. And as we were talking, we just started thinking, wow, this would make a great team taught course. And just really took the packet of papers that I'd been collecting, now divided into about 8 or 9 different folders, which fits in a semester really nicely. And that was about it, right? So before we start, what I'm going to do today is cover a bit of the historical issues about the study of emotions, and then talk more about what we're learning in current research. But I wanted to start this seminar the way we do our typical seminars by just first asking people what they think an emotion is. What is an emotion? Actually, we both start the class with that question, and the final assignment for the students at the end of the semester is to also answer that question, right? So you had your hand up, right?
Yeah, chemical reaction in the brain.
Okay, a chemical reaction in the brain, right? Fairly safe since everything in the brain is a chemical reaction, right? But that's good.
I think it's something you also feel in the body.
Okay.
Love, anger. It's not just the brain, it's the brain.
Okay, right. Yeah, that's really an important observation, and we're all very aware of the importance of the body in emotions. And as I sort of review the history, I think you'll also feel surprised at how long it took people to really focus on that, how important the body was in emotions, right? Although, the emphasis was there early on. Science, or the study of in both psychology and neuroscience, really didn't look much at the body. Anyone else?
Well, it could be, I think it could be described as something, what we experience.
Okay.
What we experience, we recognize that it has to be inside the body that we're experiencing.
Okay, so certainly there's an experiential element. We feel, right, emotions, and that, again, links it to the body. Our body is feeling the emotions as well, right? So it's a different kind of feeling than a feeling when we're just thinking, when we're not really at the same time experiencing emotion, although there's an awareness, obviously, of what we're thinking. It doesn't have that felt sensation. That seems so crucial to what an emotion is.
Maybe I'm saying the same thing, but the subconscious reaction of the brain, which affects your conscious thinking.
Okay, that's great. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about dividing, trying to find ways that we can divide what we're talking about into conscious versus unconscious. Interestingly, I think one of the reasons science was so reluctant to take up the study of emotions was because of the interest Freud had in the subconscious, and that work really became sort of discredited scientifically, right? So people didn't really want to touch it because it made people think that it was going to be sort of, it wouldn't have the sort of scientific standards that it needed, right? So the word unconscious is typically used to distinguish it from the Freudian subconscious, but actually the terminology is all over the place, right, in that. But unconscious doesn't imply the Freudian idea that what in the subconscious has to be repressed in some way. It's thoughts we don't want to have, so we try to suppress them, and unfortunately they can erupt at times, right? So the unconscious is truly unconscious. We have no awareness of it, right?
So what is, like, for instance, there's another symbol, the creative unconscious and the active imagination.
And the what?
Active imagination.
Uh-huh.
Consciously tapping into the objective unconscious.
Wow.
The creative unconscious and the active imagination. Consciously tapping into the objective unconscious.
Who's giving the seminar?
Fiona Lamb.
Fiona? Wow. Okay, that's I don't know what she's talking about. Really interesting. Yeah, no, actually, Fiona had her office next to mine because she was sort of, she was just, she's a guest, I guess, but sort of just office hopping. And it wasn't until our paths almost never crossed in spite of that. It wasn't until the end of the semester that we became aware that we had some really overlapping interests, and we're planning to get together and try to talk about what those are. But you're right, that literature has actually been very interested in some of the work that's emerging on the study of emotions, right? So
She's a literature person.
she's a literature person, right? And I think she does romantic literature, if I'm right, but
I'm kind of wondering whether emotions don't have to do with a relationship with others.
very good. Okay, actually Darwin was one of the first to really pick up on that role, particularly of emotion expression, right? That I can look at you, and by analyzing your emotions, I can get an idea of what's going on, what your intentions might be, and so forth. And you can choose to try to communicate that to me. You can try to keep that communication from me with more or less success, right? It's often very hard to control our emotional expression, although we're all pretty good at deadpanning when we need to, right? When we're actually in an interaction with someone, that kind of deadpanning becomes a lot more difficult, right?
Impulse control.
Impulse control, well, and we'll talk about what that means too, right? Any last comment anyone wants to make on that?
Can be nonverbal.
Nonverbal. I mean, it's very hard to talk about our emotions. And again, I'm trying to understand why that's true is an area that people are very interested in. No one has a good answer for that, except that there may be the parts of the brain that are being used by emotions are not those that are very closely tied to linguistic function. That's just sort of stating the obvious, I guess. But it is curious why that is true. What?
The part try to express this, but they affect our sort of cognitive view of the world or whatever. Thoughts and emotions are so connected.
Right.
Pessimistic, optimistic, whatever.
Right. And again, that has been so hard for scientists to accept, scientists of the brain to accept, because there has been such a long-standing feeling that cognitive functions are pure, right? Cognitive functions are about content. We analyze that content. We don't let emotions intrude into it, right? And that's actually maybe what can bring us to sort of talking a bit about the history of the study of emotions, because from way back, human behavior has been divided into reason on one hand, thinking, rationality, etc., and emotions, right? And emotions were always the poor relative, right? We can take many quotes from many historical philosophers and thinkers, and they all caution, or most of them, not all of them, caution against letting emotions intrude on our more higher cognitive functions, reason.
So I'm wondering if it was always that way, or where does
Yeah.
mysticism and metaphysics
Yeah,
fit in
that is
with
such a-
the
Right.
brain stuff?
Right, that is such an interesting question because certainly what we've inherited in terms of Western tradition has really been a clear dichotomy between emotions and thinking, right? And yet there has always been this sort of emotional reaction to that, right? In the sense that, there are people who simply won't accept that, and people who say, that very deliberately, there is another way of looking at it. But the powers that be, in a sense, right, the ones who are really dictating the course of science, the course of society, have really imposed this separation between, and I'll call it cognitive because that includes all of the kinds of things we talk about. It's thinking, rationality, attention, perception, memory. Those were all defined as cognitive functions that were really autonomous. They were words often encapsulated. They're not affected by all that messy stuff going on the emotional side of things, right?
And how would you relate this to the work on emotional intelligence?
Yeah.
Daniel Goleman.
Yeah.
And even I was thinking Malcolm Gladwell with his
Absolutely.
link stuff.
Right. Yeah, no, we're definitely going to get to that
Okay.
because
Yeah.
that's the way in, really, to sort of generating interest in learning about this other side of the brain. And I'm saying other side, not to say that they are anatomically separated, but as you'll see, there is some sense in which we can kind of say we've got two brains, right? How many of you have read Daniel Kahneman's book, Fast Thinking, Slow Thinking? It made a big splash a few years ago. Did you read it?
I was just going to bring that up.
Right.
It relates to this.
It does relate to this. Although then there's another group of people who say, well, there aren't such clear divisions between those two systems of thinking, right, as implied. And what we're going to talk about today is going to suggest that that division is maybe a little too emphasized in the way people are thinking about it now. So I'm going to start back sort of historically with Descartes because he's always the target here when we want to try to argue against the sort of way things are, the way we think about things in the Western world. We always sort of point to Descartes as the villain, although of course there were many wonderful contributions he made both to science and mathematics and so forth. But where he's criticized, again, is his emphasis on thinking, right, to the exclusion of other kinds of mental processes. Are you all familiar with his most famous saying, I think, therefore I am, right? And by that he meant, and he was utilizing a philosophical technique called skepticism, right? That he could be skeptical of all of his experiences, right? If he wanted to say, can I believe my visual senses, right? Am I really seeing what I'm seeing right now? Or maybe it's all a big fake. Maybe I'm dreaming. Maybe God's playing a joke on me. Can I trust my senses? Are they about anything true? And he decided that he couldn't trust any of his senses. He had no way of determining whether they were really true or not. But one thing he could be sure of was that he was, in fact, doubting whether those were true, right? And so that is what led him to reify thinking as the only sure truth that he could confirm, right? There's no question about the fact that he was, in fact, doubting the truth of all of his other experiences. So in doing that, he then sort of made a separation between thinking and all the rest of what was going on in an organism, in humans. And by that, most of it is the body, right? And I should say the body and the brain, right? Although it's often talked about, so what we're referring to now is what's called Cartesian. So things about Descartes are called Cartesian. Cartesian dualism, right, that there's a division between the mind and the rest of the body, again, body including brain. The body is material, the brain is immaterial, and it became allied with, the concept of soul and so forth. In spite of being immaterial, somehow it did have the ability to influence the body. And just as an aside, it's interesting that he localized the site of that influence in the pineal gland. Right? Does anyone know anything about what we currently know about the pineal?
The third eye.
A little. What? Is that your area? Well, let's hear a quick summary.
You were doubting me.
Right.
I know.
You know the pineal. Okay, so one of the things we know about the pineal now is that it's involved in circadian rhythms, right? That's my work on circadian rhythms was not in the pineal. It was on a sea slug, which doesn't have a pineal. Calling it the third eye isn't all that off, however, because the pineal in lower organisms actually does have photoreceptors, right?
There are tracks leading up to it.
Right. It's actually not a part of the brain in a sense, right? In that it's getting input by the sympathetic nervous system, right?
You're ahead of me.
Okay, so, but the reason he selected it,
Where is it actually located? 'Cause
it's located
Very close to in the midline.
right in the midline. It's the
of your brain?
Right, of your brain.
So you've got the
the
two
reason-
lobes, and it's like
Right. The reason Descartes selected it for containing the immaterial soul, or being able for the soul at least to act on the body through that, is as the only unpaired organ in the body, in the brain, right? And since thought was about a single thing, thought was unitary, right? Then we had to have only one source of influence of that, which is why he located the pineal. So the pineal is most known for the source of melatonin in our body, right? It's where melatonin is produced, right? So that's what we know of its current functions. So we can sort of look to Descartes then for doing two things. One, for talking about the body then as totally machine-like, right? And in fact, this is where our sense that animals other than humans are really just machines. They're just sort of reflex actions, right? And one of the places where he got that idea was the gardens at Versailles at this point were full of these little mechanical contraptions, right, that could be activated by a set of underground hydraulic pipes. So you would walk up to a bush, and by stepping on the ground, so put pressure on one of these pipes, and the bird would pop out of the mechanical bird would pop out of the tree and start flapping its wings, looking entirely lifelike, right? So machines could, in fact, look like living organisms, and all that differentiated humans from those kinds of mechanical living organisms was the fact that we did have the soul, we did have the ability to think, right? So he not only reified thinking, he then also was responsible for this form of dualism, which has been amazingly persistent in its influence in Western thought, amazingly persistent. Maybe I should even ask most of you, how many of you feel that there is a kind of dualism, that the mind is something somehow quite different than the physical substance of the body?
What do you mean by different?
Yeah, what?
That the mind can't be described by reference to the material processes, the chemical interactions, and so forth that are occurring in the brain. So something more to the mind than neurons firing, releasing neurochemicals, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I think that's clearly demonstrated by the work that's being done with the prostheses, that are people who are able to operate these things just by thinking about them.
Right.
And
so then that shows what?
That shows that the mind is clearly capable of doing more than just firing the neurons, because somehow or other it's connecting with the mechanical to enable people to
Yes.
move their hands, the new
Uh-huh.
prosthesis.
You know, No, I had
firing
never heard.
neurons.
Do you think there are more?
But it's-
Yeah, it's
I mean,
through the firing of neurons that
those
happens.
things are moving,
Right.
yeah.
So but that's an interesting interpretation. I'd never thought about it that way.
Yeah.
I would have thought about it supporting a monistic position, right? But I can see how you could also argue for that
Well,
kind of.
and in that you can't always control your mind, try as you will.
Right.
You know, you could make a case for that kind of dichotomy because it isn't something that you can just will yourself to think a certain thing or not think a certain thing. But you can will yourself to think about moving your, a prosthetic hand, and then those neurons fire and make those muscle twitches, whatever. I don't understand
No,
about
but
it.
I mean, I don't know how that happens.
Yeah,
because
but
it's so
But it is
interesting.
through
That's a
connecting
chemical
electrical wires
Yeah.
between the brain and the object you want to move, right,
But
or the computer and
Don't
so
you
forth.
have to want to? I mean, it seems to me that there is a marriage. Somewhere there's a marriage, be it, thinking and emotion. And I guess you'll bring in the sort of the developmental aspect of thinking. And when you observe a newborn baby, they're feeling.
Right.
I feel, therefore I am. I feel, therefore I cry, or whatever.
Right.
And I gather the thinking is taking place too, but it seems to me there's a marriage. And I know in old English literature there's an expression, mochi-thunk, which means heart-mind. Your heart and mind
Yes.
work together in their thinking, in their way of
Right.
thinking.
And as I said, not all philosophers, have taken up the thinking versus reason, sort of dichotomy. And people like Pascal, who said the heart has the reasons, which reason does not know, right? Which I think is really great in capturing that idea, right? But we will get into that, right? So.
Another question, I don't know if this is related, but 40-odd years ago, I remember at a lecture, the question was raised by an unsophisticated electrical engineer: can computers think?
Oh yes,
And
absolutely.
The question is, here, is there something beyond what a
Yes.
potential of a computer
Right.
and the human mind?
Yes. And that is what the question ultimately gets down to. Could I, in fact, make a computer that can do everything identical to what could be done in a human? Right? Now, a monistic position would have to say it's theoretically possible. Right? There are technical problems, obviously, and one of the questions you might ask is, can silicon ever fully take the place of, the messy, gunky biological material, right? Or is it always just going to, in some way, be a simulation, not a real thing, right? But essentially, that is the question. Do we need to know anything else other than physical processes to be able to fully describe the mind, to fully capture all the functions of the mind?
I think that relates back to the point that you were making before. What I've been reading about lately is the role of desire in not only decision making, but also impulse control.
Yeah.
And I think that's the curious, missing link in my mind about a computer making decisions.
Right.
Can you program the instinct of desire, whether it's a
Right.
desire to avoid something or desire to move towards something?
Right.
Cannot be done. Can
Right.
that be done?
Well, as we move forward in time a bit, we're going to arrive at what is called the cognitive revolution. This is cognitive psychology, and it was very successful in trying to understand many mental functions associated with thinking and perception and attention and so forth, in part by making use of what is called the computer model, looking at the brain as information processing. Right, and one of the arguments against that conception of the mind as just processing information, and if it's just processing information, then of course, yes, we should be able to make a computer that could do that. Right, it's a concept called functionalism, that it doesn't really matter what it's made out of. What matters is what it can do. Right, so if I can get a computer to do what a human is doing, even made out of different substance, they are equivalent. Right. And so the computational model was where that kind of question came up, I think. Can computers think? But one of the main objections to it was, yes, but can they feel? Right? Could you ever, and what we mean when we're feeling, of course, and desire is a good way to begin with it, is that I generate internal goals about what I want to do, right? I'm not waiting to get a program, right, sort of fed into me that tells me what I want to do. I've got some goals. I'm thinking about lunch right now, for example, right, or something like that, right? So,
Or maybe it is
will a
programmed
committee?
into you.
Well, you can always go back to that, right?
In other words, how does one handle their desires based on how they're grown up?
Right. Yeah, no, and so this is where all the these are all the great kinds of questions people are addressing now in the research. So let me get back. I'm going to compress a little bit of the sort of history, but try to run through it a bit. The next big thinker on the scene in terms of thinking about emotions actually was Darwin, right? And Darwin had a little book that was published, quite a bit after. It was meant to be included as part of his, I'm forgetting which one of his. I think it might have been Origins. I'm forgetting which one. And he realized the subject was a little bit too complex, so I ended up publishing a separate book called The Expression of Emotions in Humans and Animals, right? And it's really a great little book. And the emphasis in the title is emotion expressions, right? And so what he's doing in that book is looking at the relationship, how similar different emotional expressions are between a wide range of animals, right? And he would go as far down as bees and earthworms, right? When they get agitated, you can tell they're agitated, right? They don't look that much different than an angry human. And sort of drew attention to the fact that these are functional behaviors, and that emotions are therefore functional. They are adaptations that have been selected over evolutionary time, and there's a lot of continuity between conservation between humans and non-humans. So we can learn a lot about human emotions maybe by looking at non-humans. And so that was certainly one of his breakthroughs, is to say that we share emotional processes with non-humans. And he also was the first, I don't remember which of you brought up the idea of communication. Was that you? He also sort of asked about one of the functions of emotional expression, and one of them might be, well, you're just getting your body ready to act. The term emotion means to move, and so it, very clearly a part of an emotion is a reaction, right, to something. And as your body's getting ready to do something, you can see those preparatory things going on, right? You can see your heart begin to increase. I can see the animal starting to get ready for a behavior in a way that allows me to understand what that animal's going to do, right? And so other animals can make use of expressions by watching that, right? In addition to that, what he claimed happened in many organisms is that because there now was a communicative function that could occur in observing expressions, that aspect itself also became selected for. Right, so over time, emotional expressions became somewhat divorced from their functional purpose and became adapted for a communication function. Right, in that sense, they talk about it undergoing ritualization. If you watch birds in the spring mating, the behaviors that they go through, right, are really non-functional. They're not really doing anything but trying to get the attention of their mate. Right, but a lot of their actions look like they might peck at the ground very strongly, right? They're not trying to eat, but they may be communicating something about the vigor that they could eat with or find food with, right, to a mate that might be important for her to assess, is this going to be a good father, and so forth. So many emotional expressions became exaggerated for communication function. Right, and he made so many really great observations about emotion expression. It's not a very big book, and I would really recommend reading it. He'd ask things like, why when we're thinking about or puzzled about something do we scratch our head, right? And he can point to other animals doing similar kinds of things, that we get sort of a little bit of emotion, energy being generated when we're puzzled, and we've got to somehow dissipate that energy. So we, a little bit of a stimulus may suddenly, activate a response that wouldn't activate a response. It's just so full of wonderful insights. I really would recommend it. But what he did with that was bring emotions into the realm of biology, right? That's what he said. Emotions are a biological subject. Took biology a long time to actually accept that, right? And I would argue, in part because of dualism, right, that biology did not think of mental functions like consciousness, mental functions like emotion, as biological topics because they seem sort of not real in the way that, an arm or a leg or a lung is real. And so the study of those kinds of functions was really discouraged in biology for a very long time.
I guess it's not mechanical.
It's not mechanical, right?
But in other respects, it's
Of
the
course.
same.
Most of the people who would look at this was even true when I was a graduate student. If you brought up topics like emotion or consciousness, it was like, go with the psychologist, right? That isn't a biological subject.
Certainly true in medicine. Psychiatry.
Exactly. It's
Society.
exactly why psychiatry was separated from neurology. Why should psychiatry and neurology, there is some reason why you might want them to be separate, but certainly not as distinct as they have been. So there was still a lot of work to be done to legitimize, right, emotion as a serious topic of consideration, even within psychology. That was true. And again, within psychology, it was because what was of interest in looking at human mental functions was thinking, right? They didn't care about emotions. Those are things animals had, right? We care about what's unique to humans, and what's unique to humans is thinking. A way to start thinking about what an emotion was, I've learned this since I've been co-teaching with Elizabeth, is that, William James is sort of the Darwin of psychology, that just about any subject you want to talk about, you can go back and show that he had some really insightful thing to say about it a long time ago. He was just post-Darwin, wrote in the last part of the 1800s, early 1900s. In fact, was an avid Darwinist. He was very influenced by Darwin. But he wrote a little essay called What is an Emotion? We have our students read that also at the very beginning of the class. And one of the interesting questions that he asked about an emotion was try to imagine an emotional state and now strip all feeling from that emotional state. Do you still have an emotion? In other words, you think about being angry, but you take away all the bodily changes that are occurring when you're angry. Are you still angry? Could you really say that you're feeling an emotion anymore? And he claimed, no, all you've got left after taking away the feeling is mind stuff, right? Now you're just thinking about the emotion. You don't have any experiential thing there, so motions are experiential. Motions are in the body. And in fact, he felt this so strongly that he proposed that when I see a bear or some sort of fearful stimulus, what first happens is that I run. And it's only once I start running that I actually feel afraid, right? So he turned the sequence of what causes what totally on its head. Most people think, I see a bear, I get afraid, and because I'm afraid, I run. He said, no, that's not what happens. The stimulus, the fearful stimulus, immediately activates your body, preparing for action. And only once you become aware of the changes that are taking place, the bodily changes, it's the awareness of those bodily changes that is the emotion, right? Now, he used the word emotion, and we're going to talk more about the difference between the word emotion and feeling later, right? Because the field has now, for the most part, settled on a differentiation between those two words, emotion and feeling. That is at first a little bit difficult to accept, but over time I think it becomes sort of understandable. And the differentiation we usually make is that a feeling, and this probably isn't terribly shocking, is something you're aware of. You have conscious sensations, you could label it and so forth. An emotion is unconscious, so that's getting back to the comment that you were making. An emotion itself are the automatic, unconsciously directed processes that are activating your body. That's what an emotion is. If we become consciously aware of that, we have a feeling, right, of that emotion. Okay? And there are reasons to want to make that differentiation. And as I said, I think it's really pretty much the consensus in the field now. There are a few people holding out against that, but that's pretty much how it's, and I'll talk more about what the reasoning behind that. How long do we have? Till 11. Okay.
Lunch is at 11:30.
Okay, right.
Since we're thinking about it.
So now I'm going to jump, what? Yeah. Now I'm going to jump forward quite a bit and say that, you know, post William James, there were a few people piddling around with the topic of emotion, mostly like lesioning a part of the brain and see if you could get some sort of emotional disorder and so forth, but not much real attention. Some interesting work that was being done by a researcher who you might be familiar with, Paul Ekman, on facial expressions, and that's really an interesting topic. That's what Malcolm Gladwell, in part, wrote about. Not in Blink, in another book, I believe. Right.
The tipping point?
No, but maybe it wasn't covered. Yes, it was covered in Blink. You know, he, if any of you, and I'm not going to remember the name of this this TV series either, was featured on a TV series of being able to become really great at watching people's expressions to understand intentions. One of his claims was that when we have an emotion, we have an automatic change in facial expression, right? Now, we may try to control that, and we can do it, but we're never quite fast enough. There are these little micro expressions that slip out, and you can train people to see these, right, and get better at recognizing them. So I know whether you're telling the truth or lying, and that might have been the name of the program, right? So that, and also made the claim that emotional expressions, facial expressions are universal, right? He, you know, trucked to remote parts of all over the world, showed indigenous peoples there photographs of, you know, American faces smiling or fearful and so forth, and they were all usually able to correctly identify what that facial expression was. There's a lot of debate that remains about that, but I think more or less people think that facial expressions are pretty universal. Were you going to question?
Well,
That's interesting.
I just heard yesterday on Gary Knowles, I forgot what they call it, biochemical, I don't know what, the guy was named it, but, you know, people might, in different cultures might have stress from different things, but stress would lower the immune system.
Yeah, it does, right. Although not...
Or shame, I think they were talking about, sorry.
That shame will lower the immune system. Yeah, there's some interesting connections between...
So emotion and physical.
Right. Yeah, no, there's no question that mental states can have an impact on the immune system function, right? Absolutely no contest to that at all. How much it can, you know, is really debated, but there's no question that it can, right? So I'm going to jump ahead then to one of the main pieces of work. There were two really in the 90s, two books that were published that really turned the really brought emotion into the mainstream in a way that is responsible for the current, you know, huge increase in work on emotion now. And one of those was a neurologist called Damasio. He's written a number of popular books. I don't know anyone recognize his name. And the other one is Joseph Ledoux at NYU, who's a rat psychologist, and is responsible for the discovery of the role of this brain structure called the amygdala, which has become very well known now. He's the one who really whose work really identified the amygdala as a major brain structure involved in emotion. So I want to talk about each of their work, and then from that we can jump into all of the sort of current work that is taking up topics that a lot of you have actually already mentioned. Well, Damasio's first book is called Descartes Error, right? And Error, right? So I wanted to start with a little review of what Descartes, the consequences of Descartes' thinking, reifying thinking, right, over the sort of lowly emotions, and started with a part of the book Descartes Error, is an analysis of one of his patients that he named Elliot, who had a tumor in a part of the brain, in the frontal lobes, but in a region that is sort of down, right? Up and down also seem to relate somewhat to function, right? But he had, surgery. He seemed to fully recover, and yet he seemed a very, very different person than he did before that, so before the tumor and before the surgery. He was brought to Damasio's attention by his relatives, who said that the Social Security and other insurance benefits were going to be shut down, that he was no longer going to be seen as having a disability. And they were saying, there's no way he can function out there in the world. He can simply not function. And the insurance companies came back and said, he's just a slacker, right? So we're no longer going to support this slacker. So it's Damasio's job to try and figure out what was wrong with this guy that prevented him from living a responsible adult life in a day-to-day way, right? And he had been quite a responsible individual, relatively high up in a company, and so started using the battery of neuropsychological tests that neurologists use to try to see what parts of the brain aren't functioning the way that they should, right? Starting with IQ. Fine, in fact, above average. In fact, there was not a single neuropsychological test that he could find that would show that he wasn't either average or above average, right? Seemed like he should be able to do whatever he needed to do to hold down a job, to be a responsible father, etc. And yet nothing, no test that he had would reveal any problems. And yet he knew that there was something wrong with him. He sat and talked to this guy many times, and he knew that he wasn't, quote, normal, that his function wasn't normal. So he started thinking about, when I just look at him, when I talk to him, what am I seeing? Forget all these tests, right? What do I see when I look and I talk to him? And one thing that he saw was that he didn't seem to have many emotions. Didn't seem to be bothered by the destruction that had been happening in his life as a result of his brain tumor. Would just sit patiently no matter how long he had to wait if the doctor's appointment. Never really expressed emotions much at all. So when Damasio asked him about this, he said, "You're right, I don't really feel much," but he didn't really care about that. So there was no way to get him.
Did people find him an agreeable person to be with?
Except that he would, agreeable in that sense, but he would do very impulsive, nonsensical things that were not so agreeable, right? Have affairs, not come home when he was supposed to come home, not paying attention to his duties as a father, so those were certainly not agreeable. But his manner was maybe, right. So,
This particular thing is one of the blessings, if you want to say, of a person who has a frontal tumor and is dying and shows very little concern,
no concern about it. Right.
About
Yeah.
the outcome of their life.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, no, it probably is a blessing in that
Does
sense.
that happen often?
It does, with
Wow.
certain kinds of brain damage, and that's what, Damasio
What
wanted
kinds
to
of
go.
brain damage?
Well, to this part of the brain, it's said frontal, a certain part of the frontal lobe anyway, to the amygdala that we just talked about. It's another brain lesion that will produce an individual who really doesn't care much about the, horrific things that might be going on in their life, including being mugged or something. They just sort of blow it off. It doesn't really have that much impact on them. And then one more region of the brain that he focused on that I want to talk about in a moment. So he started thinking, okay, well, let's just test the emotional reactions of this guy. And one way to test emotional reactions is with a lie detector, right? That's what a lie detector is used for. Since when we have an emotion, we get those automatic body activations, I can record those changes in your body no matter how hard you try to hide it. I'll see those little blips. Right? Now, there are a lot of problems with the lie detector test, but they can be used in psychological assessments to good purpose. Right? So one of the things that, you know, if I were to put you in a room, I could test what's called a skin conductance response. Right? How quickly an electrical current will move between two little electrodes on your arm. Right? Just the tiniest increase in sweating, something you would not notice, will cause an increase in the conductance of that current that I can register. That will be that little blip on the page. Right? So if I put you in front of a screen and show you a terrible picture, right, boom, I'm going to record a real change in your autonomic response. We call that autonomic, right? But to first see whether he was even capable of generating an autonomic response, they just had a really unexpected loud noise, a shock of some kind. And all of us will, you know, when we hear that. We can't help but do that. And, you know, regardless of whether you feel emotional or not, that's going to happen. So he did that fine, right? So he could generate a skin response. He could generate an autonomic response. But sit him in front of a horrible movie, flat, right? Even if he would talk about the fact that, well, those were sort of bad things that were happening, he didn't show the body reaction, right? And so he started really then thinking about the importance of the body reaction for the emotion. Going back to James, right, that can you have the emotion if you can't have the body reaction? And he also started thinking about what's wrong with these neuropsychological tests. Why can't I pick up anything wrong with this guy? Most of the tests were testing cognitive functions, right? Decision making or how you perform on puzzles and so forth. And he started saying, now, why can't he function on these well and not make the simple decisions, responsible decisions he has to make in his day-to-day life? And then he started thinking, you know what? The decisions you make in your day-to-day life are really complex for the most part, really complex, right? I mean, what you need to do when you're taking these tests, if you make a wrong decision, so what? There's no consequence to it. In real life, every decision has a consequence, right? And you have to worry and think about that consequence. So actually, these tests are not a very good test of real-life function, right? What we need is a test that will give us some way of understanding the kind of decision-making that has to occur in the real world, right? So he and some colleagues ended up devising this test that's now known, because Damasio at that time was at the University of Iowa, called the Iowa Gambling Test.
The Iowa
Gambling test. Gambling. Because he said, gambling is a really complex kind of decision-making involved in it. So maybe we can work out a gambling test as a way to try to get closer to real-world kinds of decision-making.
Game theory.
Well, it's somewhat like game theory, right? So the gambling test was, you have 4 decks, and really only 2 that we have to worry about. And you just draw from each deck randomly, right? And every time you draw a card, you get a reward. But occasionally, you get a punishment. You get a loss. You lose some money, right? So one deck, it turns out, has relatively low rewards, but its punishments are also quite low, right? So after about 100 or so draws, you're going to be coming out okay on that deck, right? Or actually, even after 20 or 30, you're starting to do okay, but after 100, it's really clear. On the other deck, you get these big rewards, say $100 instead of 20, but then you get these outrageous punishments where you lose $1,000, right? So very quickly, you're in the red on the what we call the bad deck, right? So we just give someone a neurologically normal person that test, and very quickly they start figuring out which is a good deck, right? And they seem to do it even before they can consciously say, I think I'm getting a better payoff on this deck. They just start using that deck more often. Except Elliot would not continue to draw from the bad deck, right?
But would gambling addicts go for the higher risk
Yeah.
one?
Now, so that test has actually now been used diagnostically for a lot of other things besides this kind of frontal disorder. For example, many people with addiction will perform poorly on that test. Not all, and that has led to sort of thinking about there being sort of two ways we could think, two disorders associated with addiction. One which is doing poorly on the alpha gambling test, and the other is not. And so there's got to be something else going on.
And when you were talking about decisions in our daily life having consequences, and they talk about adolescents' brains not being
Yeah.
developed enough,
Right.
Is that all have to do with?
Yeah.
Is that an actual biological
Absolutely.
development?
Right. The frontal lobes where this is happening is the latest part of the brain to develop, and is not fully developed now. The date keeps moving forward, I think until early 20s.
Yeah.
Right?
You can tell how old my daughter is.
This is the law and order theory going on.
Oh, yeah? Right. So.
And beyond, right?
No, it really is. It really is. Well, it's interesting for two reasons. One, issues of legal responsibilities of responsibility, of course. The other, which is more distressing, is that drugs have a different kind of effect on brains that are developed than they do in developing brains, and therefore, first of all, there's additional concern with alcohol for that reason. Right, that adolescents and drinking alcohol may have more serious impact and a more longer-term impact than in adults. But also with all these other drugs, the pharmaceutical drugs that are being used for younger and younger and younger people, right? And not having an understanding about how those drugs are interacting with the developing brain versus the adult brain in which they've been tested, right? We test these pharmaceuticals in adult brains, not in developing brains. And we know that there's a real difference.
Is there any evidence of a gender divide as well in terms of the timescale of development?
Yeah, there are clear differences. I don't know them all offhand. I think we all, if we've been around kids or have kids, know that females tend to develop more rapidly, intellectually as well as physically than males do, right? And there are a number of ways where a number of tests that can show that.
Should we go back to an all-girls school?
Yeah,
It's one argument that can be made for it, yeah.
I'm a counselor with the California Department of Rehabilitation, and one of the reasons I wanted to come to this seminar is that I have been noticing, seemingly, that many of my clients who have gotten themselves into some very serious situations are that they don't see consequences of their decisions.
Yeah.
People that are doing obvious things that other people wouldn't be doing.
Right.
They're doing.
Yeah.
And they don't see it.
Yeah.
They don't see it. They don't
Right.
recognize
And you
it.
wonder how much of that is socialization too versus biology to a certain extent. And there's certainly, it's almost impossible to separate the two. I shouldn't put them as opposites. But one of the things that we're going to talk about later on are the sort of ways that the sort of what we would call more cognitive parts of the brain are able to inhibit the more reactive parts of the brain. And you can exercise that, right? You can get those connections to become stronger, right?
One of the things,
And that's part of what sort of parenting is about, right? Trying to develop. The consequences, they might not, so you have to train them.
And
on
delayed
that.
gratification.
Delayed gratification,
Understanding that
right.
You can't have everything immediately.
Right. I mean, certainly there does seem, I don't know how many of you, this is getting a bit off tack, but it's a really interesting example, know of the marshmallow test?
Yes.
Yeah, right? Not all of you. Should I go over? Taking these little kids, 2, 3, 4 years old, and putting a marshmallow on the table in front of them, and then saying now, I have to go off and do something for a moment, But when I get back, you'll be able to eat that marshmallow. But don't eat it while I'm away. If you do, right, you're not going to, if you don't eat it, I'll give you another marshmallow, so you'll have two. Right, if you eat it, that's it, right? You're not going to get another marshmallow. So they leave, but for a long time. I'm forgetting what the time for a little kid, it's a long time, 5 minutes or something, and they're sitting there looking at that marshmallow. And you can see, the sort of like they reach for it and they sometimes sit on their hands or they try to look away so they don't have to see it. But what's really amazing about that is that the children who could wait, right, and get that second marshmallow have higher SAT scores, do better on many measures of success in life. It's an amazing correlation.
So how can we do that?
Well, that's what I'm saying is there might be a biological element that's not saying that the other kid couldn't learn to develop that kind of control or delayed gratification, but you might have to work harder to teach them that. Whereas some of these little kids seem to do it without much teaching, right? So going back to Damasio, one last really intriguing experiment. And when I say Damasio, I should actually say that they're a man and wife team. Antonio Damasio does most of the writing. So the books have usually been authored by him, and so he gets the hog's share of the attention. But his wife, Hannah Damasio, is actually a very talented scientist as well, and is the one who suggested the skin response test and suggested a number of other experiments that turned out to be really key. And one of those suggestions was, why don't we take a skin response test while people are playing the Iowa gambling test and just see what happens? And what they did was find out that for a normal person, after drawing from the decks for a while, as they started reaching towards a bad deck, they got a little skin response blip, right? And that made them sort of change, decide to choose the other deck instead. That little blip, and this is a piece that's a little debated, occurred before they could consciously say, I think this deck is better than that deck. So they were getting feedback from their body, right, about the experience they'd had with the two decks at an unconscious level was being summarized by the autonomic nervous system in generating the skin response, right? When you looked at people who don't perform well on the Iowa gambling test, no blip. So this is called a anticipatory skin response. It's the gut feeling, right, that we're talking about. Like, I just feel, right, that I'd rather do this, right? And you can get this body measurement associated with that. So that led him to develop what he called the somatic marker hypothesis, that our bodies are accumulating markers of our experience that are used to help us make decisions, right? So when we have to make a very complicated decision, it's too complicated for logic, right? I can't sit and write out the list of here are the advantages and here are the disadvantages. Most decisions that we have to make in real life are way too complicated for plain old logic, right? That's why computer scientists have had such a difficult time getting a computer to do well what humans can do so well. They're good at doing things humans can't do, the sort of data, sort of brute processing kind of thing. But to quickly recognize a stimulus that they'd seen before, but in a completely different orientation, forget it. That's an incredibly complicated kind of processing. And the same is true with many of our decisions. Too complicated for logic. So what do I have to do? I sort of think about my past experience, but I don't even have to think consciously about my past experience, right? I can get this body marker that summarizes my past experience in terms of good or bad, right? Was it good? Was it bad? If it's good, go for it, right?
Has it been studied, do people vary markedly in that? I happen to be married to one. She reacts immediately to everything, and I want to get the data. I'm a scientist by
Right.
background. I want to get the data and the information.
Right, yeah. No, I know.
You
Certainly.
want to verify. You're right.
I'm more more like you. I'm a scientist, right? And I sort of say, like, wait a minute, right? Let's think about this, right? So there definitely is. But, one interesting study that people have done in getting at this is again leading to these two ways of thinking, right? The fast and the slow. And what are the benefits and the drawbacks in each? And there are benefits and drawbacks in each. But one interesting study that was done, and interestingly, there was a lot of this kind of work going on in consumer psychology that never made it into mainstream academic psychology until recently, right? Which is so interesting. There's a lot that's been learned about this in terms of how to get people to buy things, right? That just hasn't been, looked at by academic psychology.
Yeah, I wanted to say on that point, I have a company, I own the company, and one of the activities we're engaged in is online retail. And our marketing department spends a lot of time thinking about the environment that we're creating for new customers to send that signaling.
Right.
We're okay.
Right.
And we spend a lot of time working on authentic marketing language so that our integrity is communicated in very fine, points like you were saying.
Right. So you're appealing to the sort of wisdom of emotional experience. In a way, that's what you can call it, right? That you've accumulated this information, these experiences, and there's a lot of valuable information in that.
We get a lot of criticism for how we design our marketing, that they say we're not commercial because we're not going for old school sort of used car salesman sales techniques. We use those too, but we use them in a very careful sort of fine pointed.
Right. Well, with the whole explosion of neuroscience now, they have neuro everything, so there's a neuromarketing, right, kind of thing now, right? But in terms of these decision makings, the sort of two ways, one study that did is looked at, people who will, if they want to buy something, make their decision very quickly, refrigerator, car, whatever, something maybe even relatively big, and then look at, someone who takes a lot of time and compares and so forth, and asks about their satisfaction once the decision has been made. People who made the quick decisions are often much more satisfied with their decision. Does that fit your experience?
Yes.
Well, maybe because it's a more satisfying decision-making, whereas it's excruciating to compare. They say on the shelves when there are too many boxes of cereal, you're less likely to buy anything.
And once you've made your decision, if you've really taken time over it, you continue to think about all the things you could have gotten if you didn't decide that, right? So you're never happy, right? So it isn't saying we should always be impulsive, obviously, but it is, showing that, it's complicated. Trying to understand how these processes work is very complicated. Does someone have their hand up?
No, I was just going to say what you just said.
Okay, right.
I was going to say, like your gut reaction or intuition, you feel in your body.
Right.
Well, what you're saying is that really comes first.
That
at
comes
least
first.
Before the emotional. Does it come first before the scientific reasoning? I've been noticing
that's a really good point too.
Especially when I talk to my sister, I notice the physical before I get frustrated and
it does happen first.
First.
And that's what.
And that should be a mechanism for me to
sort of say, okay, I see this happening. I'm aware of this happening.
And I don't even have to think about the emotional stuff.
Yeah.
I can just say,
right. In
about
fact,
the
that
physical stuff.
right. That is one way that, actually going back to Paul Ekman with the facial expression stuff, who's been teaming up with the Dalai Lama a lot lately, and they wrote a book together recently, thinking, the sort of the best of the Eastern, the best of the Western, sort of research on emotion. Let's compare notes. Where do we agree, disagree, kind of thing.
Well, what is the Dalai Lama providing here?
Just sort of the Eastern approach to emotions. And, one of the strategies that they sort of looked at was, how reactive people are to the sort of that immediate reaction that I talked about, the sort of and that some people are really reactive. When a loud noise happens, boom, they just really, and others aren't. And that's a good way to try to think about the kind of people who need some extra help, need to learn to pay attention to the changes in their body a bit more, because they need more control, right? That's just physiologically, there's not, I mean, and one of the things that
So you
happens,
relate that to
obviously,
impulse control.
yeah, is that once you've gotten that body reaction, that can sort of start a whole cascade going, right? Because once your body starts feeling like that, then you're starting to feel the emotion, and that may, sort of precipitate further, right? So it's like you have to stop that cascade.
The reason lecture is really scientist, which I didn't fully understand, but the bottom line is the comparison between the computer and the human brain is the human brain is less accurate. And it's very important, he said, to be less accurate in your thinking, which, again, focus on the...
Yeah, that's really interesting.
And this was a critical difference he found.
Uh-huh. Was there something written about? Did you read this, or?
No, he gave this lecture, very profound. He's
We
very...
can get the name.
Yeah, that would be, I'd be interested in.
He's very focused on
Yeah.
the fact that this inaccuracy of the brain is very important
Right.
in how we function.
Uh-huh. Yeah, no, that actually makes lots of sense, in part because we can't take the time to do these laborious computations, right? And so we have to go, I don't know if this is what he was trying to say, we have to go, be able to deal with a little inaccuracy, which can then be used as data.
It's a matter, it's critically
That's
important.
critical.
It's critically important.
Was that Shlomo Brezhnitz or something?
Perhaps.
Because he also does expectation things, like he
Mhm.
took, one experiment was that he does, the military guys, they could all march 40 kilometers really well, so he tells one group you're going to march 40 kilometers, one group you're going to march 20 kilometers, one group you're going to march 60 kilometers, and they all have to, and how they perform,
Uh-huh.
based on what they expect.
Right, based on what their expectations are. Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't know if any of you caught this study a couple years ago now, where they exercise physiologists really looking at, sort of limits of the body in terms of performance. So looking at extreme exercisers and, in particular looking at marathon runners in terms of when they get fatigued and the idea that they should be drinking a bit during their race, for example, and something with some instant energy in it, Gatorade or something that has some sugar. And asking the question, do you really need the sugar, right? Is that really important in being able to continue, right, this performance? And, they did the need control, which is give them both a drink of what tasted like the Gatorade, but in one there was no real sugar, right? So there wasn't any energy that could be used. They got a boost in their performance that was identical to the boost that the one that drank the sugar. How did that work? Right? Your brain fatigues before your body fatigues, right? And that's sort of what you were saying in terms of expectations, right? And if you can trick your brain and to increase your expectations a bit, your muscles still have some room for work.
How can
Right?
I use that to be more productive?
Yeah,
You
so
know,
you had
you were talking about the emotion-body connection. Well, from a performing point of view, if you're an actor and like you have to do 300 shows, you don't always feel it.
Right.
But if you make your body do the thing,
Yeah.
sometimes your emotions will fill it in, and vice
Right.
versa too. Like if you don't feel it physically,
Yeah.
so there is that direct
Absolutely.
application
Yeah.
in terms of the arts.
Are you an actress?
Actress, yes.
Right. Yeah, no, that was another thing I actually found out from one of my students' conference projects, right, who was an actress and wanted to look at the sort of ways that people train actors and how consistent was about that in terms of what we knew about biology.
Yes.
And intriguingly, going way back, theaters or sort of people who were training actors were using biology to think about how to train actors.
Well, you
and
talked about the universality, and I thought of
Right.
Commedia dell'arte, which is like applies to all culture. You know, it's that broad.
I see. Right.
You know what they're doing, even if you don't speak that
Right.
language, and there's
Uh-huh.
that sort of.
Right. Okay, so Damasio, what does he conclude? You need emotion for decision making, right? So going back to this whole Descartes idea that, thinking should be isolated from emotion or the wisdom of the philosophers throughout the age, without emotion, your decision-making functions are completely impaired, right? So It isn't just that they can help. Elliot couldn't do anything. He was completely dysfunctional without having any problems with his, quote, intellectual facilities. They were all where they should be, above average in most cases. What did he miss? He missed the emotion, right? So emotions are central to decision making, right? Not saying that sometimes they can't be disruptive, right?
Did he get the insurance company?
He did, yes. So they did agree with him that he was disabled, and that was
Did he
continued.
perceive himself as disabled?
He wouldn't have cared, right? I mean, that's what's,
Okay.
and that really, that links to another interesting example. So Damasio then wanted to say, okay, where else in the brain? This is a region, has a long name, it doesn't really matter, but calls the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. The frontal cortex, but sort of at the bottom and right in the middle. And for the most part, people think of the cortex, we talk about medial being the middle and lateral being the outside, as organized such that the medial regions tend to be the older from an evolutionary point of view, and the lateral are the more, if you want to call it, pure cognitive, if there is any such thing after this example from Elliot, right? But we tend to think of those parts of the brain as being the brakes, right, on the sort of more rapid emotional responses. So certainly there are times when we have to put on the brakes, right? There's no question about that we have to regulate the sort of immediate impulsive control, emotional reactions. Why do you think that is? Why is there such an importance? There is a lot that we have to regulate about our emotional behavior, right? Absolutely. Why do you think that is? Why can't we just let evolution have taken care of it for us, and our emotional reactions are the ones that are the most functional, the most adaptive, and so forth?
Probably because there are other people around.
There are other people around. That's exactly it. That's exactly it, because we are intensely social organisms, and our own self-interests are not always consistent with the self-interest of the group, right? That's exactly it. And much of those other regions of the brain, as well as the emotional parts of the brain, we already talked about them involved in being social because they were communicating between mates and so forth, right, is about social behavior, right? So a lot of what we call, the study of emotion is really about the study of social behavior, right? So it's really hard to draw the line between a study of social behavior and emotions.
So one other question. Was he able to label whatever the dysfunction was that Elliot had so that it could actually be documented as a legitimate condition?
And
there
diagnosed
must
in
be a
other people.
continuum.
Yeah, and there is, but I don't know of any specific label for that. That's a really curious thought. I haven't just thought about it before.
Because other people
I think, you
probably have it. And
Yeah,
there is
exactly.
there is this, sort of a syndrome called frontal lobe syndrome, right, with damage to the frontal lobe, but it doesn't totally match there are different kinds of frontal lobe syndromes. And Elliot has some of those that are shared by lesions in other parts of the frontal lobe and not others. So I don't know of any name that captures his particular variety or not.
Isn't it true that, do you remember the prefrontal lobotomy?
Right.
I don't think that's done anymore, but that's exactly the result.
Yeah. Yeah, that is what or what's called leucotomy, where they try to just interrupt the connections between the two, was trying to break the connections between the emotional parts of the brain and those parts. Yeah.
Were they
I
successful?
presume you talk about some plasticity of the brain will emerge here, if not. The
Yeah.
prefrontal lobe, just to say this, I'm sure you
Right.
happen to hear talk about it, actually physically changes with emotion, with love relations, for example. The prefrontal lobe gets bigger.
Yeah, no, the plasticity of the brain is really pretty significant, right? And that's why when I don't remember when we were talking about the fact that we can train people to have better impulse control, to have better emotion regulation. And what you're doing when you do that is, in fact, strengthening the connections between parts of the brain that don't have connections that are quite as strong as maybe they should be.
I don't know much, I'm sure you do, but functional MRI must be something you're familiar with.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
I don't know anything, but this must reflect, give us somewhat a handle on figuring out what parts of the brain are functioning under certain
Yeah,
circumstances.
absolutely. Yeah, and really one part of the big explosion in the study of emotions is being able to use functional NMR, functional, right, to MRI, right, to look at the different parts of the brain that are active, as you're carrying out different kinds of mental functions. It's been huge. Much of the human work is that, right? So
Could you talk a little bit about what happens during dementia with the frontal lobe and that decision-making?
well, there are a few different forms of dementia. Alzheimer's, obviously, and frontotemporal dementia, I think, is what the other form is called. Dementia is just a pretty general term to mean loss of cognitive functions, right? In Alzheimer's, one that we, really focus on, at least initially, is memory loss, right? Sort of real impact on memory functions. I'm going to get to memory functions in a moment, but a part of the brain called the hippocampus, which is really doing a lot of what we call explicit memory, the kind of memory we're aware of, and when we want to think back about things that happened in our life. That's part of the brain that's really affected first and maybe most significantly. So you get a lot of that memory loss in. Then frontotemporal dementia is a really odd mix of symptoms, and I'm not as up on that as I should be, but it includes very dramatically an element of not caring, right? Of sort of this not being aware really of, I shouldn't say not caring, not being aware, right? And that's what, right, actually the next piece that Damasio did was say, okay, where else in the brain will a lesion give me this sort of odd combination of intact cognitive function, right, but poor decision making, right, because of the loss of emotional function, right? So the combination of intact cognitive function and poor decision making. And one region of the brain, another region of the brain was the amygdala, but another region of the brain was a region called the somatosensory cortex, right? A part of in a lobe of the brain called the parietal lobe. It's where information from our skin senses go to the brain to be analyzed. As well as a region related to that, which is now becoming very famous, called the insula. See, that name crept out to anybody yet? It's starting to get a lot of fame.
Insula? Say it again.
INSULA. It's a buried lobe of the brain, sort of buried under the temporal lobes a bit, or frontotemporal. There's just some fascinating work with that lately, but I think I'm not going to have time to cover it today. But one of the interesting kinds of deficits you see when you get the somatosensory lesions, typically will happen that the lesion is on one side of the body, one side of the brain, so the opposite side of the body is affected, right? So there may be paralysis or loss of sensation, usually both, in fact. And what's interesting here is that the individual will completely deny that they've lost function, right? So it's, well, I really feel bad that you can no longer use your left hand. So I can use my left hand. And say, okay, well, do you want to pick this up? And said, well, maybe I'll do it later, right? Or find some other excuse for their not being able to carry out the command, but continue to deny that they've lost any function at all.
That's insula.
No, well, yeah, and the somatosensory, right? But associated with that was also this total lack of emotion. Hasn't been focused on that much in that disorder because of these other very prominent and odd, sort of symptoms, but led Damasio to think again more about the body. Well, what are you losing when you're disrupting somatosensory cortex? You're losing all that information from the body that was responsible for the skin conductance response, right? And so he started really thinking about the body and the self, right? That the self is really an ongoing monitoring of the body, in a sense, right? And links it to these really basic processes like homeostasis, right? That what we're doing is constantly monitoring how well is our body doing. And we're constantly assessing stimuli out there in terms of, are they going to benefit me in my body, or are they going to disrupt me in my body, right? So he's really allying the body and the self as really central, right? And so again, turning, the sort of wisdom of Western philosophy on its head, not just in the sense that decision-making is absolutely dependent on emotions, right? But our whole sense is, in fact, a body-linked sense. Awareness is a body-linked thing. And so he then is calling feelings the awareness, right? And it's of our body, right? So feelings are always linked to the body. Emotions are the responses we have that may be automatically activated and are activating our body, but we're not necessarily aware of them. Feelings are what we're aware of. Right? Well, I realize I'm really just about out of time, and
How accessible is his book to a non-scientific person? And is there a particular book, this guy we're talking about?
Damasio.
Damasio. Is there a particular book, and is it accessible to somebody who's not a scientist?
Let's see, Damasio's book is called Descartes Error, and
Okay,
that's the one from 1994. And he's had a whole range of. He's not the most clear writer, I do have to say. And in part, he is, I think, Portuguese. I think, or Spanish. So he's not native speaking. Although he's, I don't even know that you'd notice much of an accent that he has. But
Ekman's book with the Dalai Lama, that's probably
yeah,
accessible
I don't know the
to
name
lay
of that,
reader,
but if you
yeah.
just Google those, you'll come up with something. Another, some of the books that we use in our course. Ledoux also has a book. It starts getting a little bit hairy, but there are parts of it that are really intriguing and accessible, I think, and it's just called The Emotional Brain.
What about Richard Davidson?
Yeah, Richard Davidson has some very good books as well. I don't know. I know he has a recent one.
About emotions.
Yeah. Right.
It's interesting that it was a Portuguese who did the frontal.
It is.
Who won a Nobel Prize
For the frontal lobotomy. Right.
Actually, he should have won the Nobel Prize for angiography, which he also invented.
Really?
Oh yeah. But they gave the prize for the wrong thing.
For study of the vascular
all the
system.
angiograms done today came
Right.
from that.
Okay, so maybe I'll just, what I was going to cover about Joseph Ledoux, who works on rats, right? Which seem, really it seems really odd. He had to work very hard to get people to accept his work, and because he was working on rats, and that was not going to be
And people just have
generalizable.
emotional reactions.
Right. Well, it's just not general. What are we going to learn about humans from that? And actually, we've learned a tremendous amount about human emotional systems from his work on rats. And one of the things that he discovered, if I'm going to say this really quickly, is that he tried to take a really standard neurobiological approach of understanding sensory systems and say, okay, you just start with the stimulus and you try to follow that stimulus in as it's processed in the brain, and that's how you find out what you need to know about things like perception and so forth. So I'll do the same thing with emotions, right? I'll provide an emotional stimulus, and I'll watch how that's processed in the brain, right? But, okay, how do you find an emotional stimulus that you can work with without all kinds of messy, interpretations? So he worked on something called fear conditioning, right? So he had the rats, put them in a little cage, rang a bell, and then shocked them, okay? And then after a while, just ringing the bell, they started showing a fear response, right? So he said, okay, all I need to do is follow where that bell stimulus, produces the fear response. So let's take out the auditory cortex, right? If the rat can't hear the bell, probably can't feel afraid, right? Wrong, right? Took out the auditory cortex, no problem in fear conditioning, right? So where on earth was this auditory stimulus being analyzed? because at that point, was not thought it went anywhere about the cortex. Went to the amygdala, right? So the auditory stimulus zipped over to this other structure called the amygdala. And the amygdala has enormous connections throughout the entire brain and is capable of activating the autonomic nervous system, capable of activating everything you need to have activated to generate a fear response. And it does it instantly and automatically, right? So he called that the low road, right? Now, what he discovered was that, of course, it does go to the auditory cortex to be analyzed, but once it's already been analyzed, it comes back to the amygdala, right? So the amygdala is actually getting two inputs. This very fast automatic input, right? That, you've got it. If you don't move quickly, you're going to get bit by that snake. And then, oh God, it's not a snake anyway. It's just a piece of wood on the ground, right? That's the more deliberate analysis that is taking place. Slower, more cognitive, more detail, but it gets there a little bit later, right? But it's okay. I've gotten safe now. I can laugh at the mistake I made, but I'm safe, right? If it had been a snake, I would have been safe. So what this means is that fear learning, occurred in the amygdala. Okay, so there I'm doing emotional learning in this really automatic, unconscious region of the brain, right? Now we know of another region of the brain that is implicated in learning, and that's the hippocampus that I talked about. Have you heard about this patient HM?
Yeah.
Right?
The
He had
author was interviewed yesterday.
Who was?
The author.
The author, right. HM was called HM. I think he's now known as Harry because he died just a few years ago, but his hippocampi were removed 50 years ago now probably because of really intractable epilepsy that was being, the focus of that was in the hippocampi. And when they took out the hippocampi in monkeys or something, no problem. So they thought they could do it in a human as well. They did it. It really did improve his epilepsy, but it left him without the ability to learn any new information for the rest of his life, right? And that meant that his doctor would come in and talk to him. The doctor would walk out the door, would return 5 minutes later, and he would not know who he was, right? Well, what was discovered was that although he didn't have that kind of learning, he did have some other kind of learning available, and this was a kind of learning that was described by other neurologists much longer ago with the same kind of amnesic patient. Put a pin in his hand, and when he walked in and shook the woman patient's hand, the pin stuck her, right? The next time he walked in, she didn't remember who he was. He put out his hand to shake it. I'm not going to shake that hand, right? So the emotional memory was being stored in a region outside of the hippocampus, in the amygdala. So as Joseph Ledoux talks about it, the amygdala is the emotional memory. The memory about the emotion is in the hippocampus, right? So we have different memory systems. What's really insidious about emotional memory is that once you've got it, it just sticks around forever.
That's in
right?
the amygdala?
In the amygdala. It's really, really a persistent form of memory. We're now finding some ways of trying to disrupt that memory in the amygdala, but for all practical purposes, that kind of emotional learning, you don't want to lose, right? Well, there's one form of trying to get over that is used, and so panic reactions or phobic responses, that kind of emotional learning has occurred, and now it's really, really hard to wipe out again. And one methodology people use is what's called exposure therapy, right? Expose the person to the stimulus in a safe condition, and over time, rather than associate it with fear, maybe they'll start associating it with something not fearful, safety, or even pleasant. Great, doesn't work all that well, right? And the reason it doesn't work all that well, Joseph Ledoux discovered, we call this extinction training in the laboratory. If I ring the bell a lot of times without shocking the rat, after a while the rat stops paying attention to the bell, right? Makes sense, right? But you ring the bell once, boom, it's got that memory back again. So what you're doing with extinction learning is learning. You're not overriding the old memory. You're not rewriting it. It's there. What you're doing is learning a new memory that you can recall if you need to, and use that memory to guide your behavior. But you've got that old memory there, and it's ready to come back anytime it seems to be needed.
Is that like, relaxation and behavior modification?
You learn to, yeah.
When you have that fear
That's
stimuli?
that's in part what you're doing.
Is that how they're treating PTSD and some of these other?
Yeah, and what is discovered that extinction is the frontal cortex coming back to the amygdala and inhibiting it, right? But the learning is still there. So this seems to be very unplastic in that sense, right? That it's really there. But we're now finding lots of ways to try to regulate that through plastic changes that can be occurring in the frontal lobe, right? Again, I'm going to end with this, I think, because it's after 12. One of the interesting insights that's coming in is that any kind of cognitive activity that's activating the prefrontal cortex actually inhibits some of these subcortical regions, like the amygdala. If I am teaching a child to use words to describe their emotions, how are you feeling when the kid's starting to look angry and act angry? How are you feeling? And if you ask them to start talking about, use words to talk about their feelings, boom, those lower parts of the brain are starting to be inhibited. And the same regions of the brain are being used in every kind of process you can use to try to inhibit that. So it doesn't matter how we do it, if we can just build those pathways from the prefrontal cortex to the amygdala and make them stronger, we can do it by using words, through language. We can do it by what's called reassessment training that's used for anxiety and so forth. If I think about a stimulus and I'm afraid of it, I just try to have to think about it in a less, so I'm using thinking as a way to try to regulate my reaction, sort of what you described. What, again, I'm doing is the same pathway is being strengthened. Right. Okay, so I'm going to end there. We touched on a lot of different topics, I know. But I'll stay for any questions.
Well, one question I would like to know, what's going to be the title of your book?
It's going to be called The Feeling Brain. The Feeling Brain, yeah, just take it from our title. This Biology and Psychology of Emotions.
When will it be published?
Well, right now we have got to get all the chapters in July 1st. Still going to have editing to do after that, but our editor hasn't given us a good sense of how rapidly that process goes after that point. Hopefully, yeah. We've been working on it a while. Right. As you can imagine, when you're teaching, there's not very much time left. So this is summer. This is sort of summer work kind of thing.
So somebody wrote a book called Get Out of Your Mind and Into Your Life. And I've just started looking at it. It's kind of like a workbook. I think they're saying to assess the feelings.
Yes.
And not go into that.
Right. No, in a way, sort of using language is asking you to do that too, right? Assessing your feelings by...
No, I mean assessing your bodily.
Oh, assessing your bodily, right.
Yeah.
And so
because if that's coming first,
right.
then you're just going into a loop by trying to think it.
Right. There are now these sort of two pathways that people are sort of thinking about therapeutically. And one is really cognitive. Cognitive behavioral therapy has been quite successful in treating depression, anxiety, and the mechanism we're now learning by which that occurs is what I've just described. But there is sort of an emotional approach to, right now this is the hot topic, is the cognitive regulation. But I think that taking the emotional route should not be overlooked at all. The physical, right.
You think about deciding, thinking things through and how long that could take. I mean, even, I'm trying to figure out what to do in the day and the order to do it.
Right.
And it takes so much time sometimes. I should just go to the library now and take care of that. But then, I'm not sure I do something else.
Right. Well, where the sort of feeling or body part is coming in is meditation.
Mindfulness.
Mindfulness, right. That's really what that, yeah. Right, exactly. Right, and if you think about, I know when I had my second child, and this was at a time when, you were encouraged to really be a real she and not use any pain medication in delivery. And the first time, when a contraction would happen, just grab the handles and just like totally prepare for it by completely tensing my body. And, at one point a nurse came and started peeling my fingers off and said, you got to just relax. Right? So I remembered that for my next delivery. And every time I'd have a contraction, just like totally relax my body. And no one could even see that I was having a contraction. And it was like it just went zip, zip, zip. And that's essentially what meditation is teaching you to do. I say, I can feel the pain, but I'm not letting it, I'm disconnected from it. Right? Totally disconnected.
Isn't that what you do when you're going through transcendental meditation?
Yeah. I didn't know that I was using a meditation technique at the time, but it really worked well, and it was just to. There's so much interesting work done on pain now and emotion, right? And that pain is mostly a little bit of a sensation, but most of it is a reaction, a psychological distress, right? And those are two separate parts of the brain. So you can work with the distress, even though the stimulus is the same, you can really change the amount of pain you feel associated with it. But, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And he's still around. Yeah. He's still writing.
40 years ago. I can't be.
He died at 60.
No, I said I read his book 40 years ago.
Oh, no, he is still around. Absolutely. And he's still on that subject.
I just asked you, maybe in your words,
Can these nerves and neurons really change